1873, Thomas Gray met and fell in love with Ann Mellors, an attractive 27-year-old who lived with her mother and her younger brother. The family lived above a grocer's shop, which the two women ran together, in the village of Colston, in Nottinghamshire. Thomas had been infatuated by the woman that he'd watched on many occasions pulling up the shutters of the shop every morning. Anne, on the other hand, was far less enamoured. She was flattered by the attention and agreed to meet him on odd occasions, but she never intended the relationship to go very far. So when Thomas asked her to marry him towards the end of that year, he was instantly told no. Somewhat annoyed by the proposal, Anne also put a stop to their friendship, and Thomas retreated back to his family. To him, it was a devastating denial of the love that he held for her. To Anne, he'd just been an irritation. For her, he'd never been a true suitor. So, apart from a passing comment made to her mother the same day, it was never discussed again. As far as can be gathered, the two, despite living in the same village, kept to their respective ends of the street without ever meeting until the 20th of August 1877. In the intervening 4 years, Anne met and became engaged to a man called Joseph Holt, and the two planned to marry the following year, whilst Thomas, on the other hand, had become increasingly reclusive, suffering from a variety of illnesses, the causes of which had proved very difficult to diagnose, though in the main these illnesses seemed to affect his mind more than his body. According to his father, they'd caused his son to retreat even further from the realities of his life, which in turn had a serious effect upon his physical capabilities. By early 1877, when he suffered some sort of seizure or fit, he'd stopped helping to farm the 30 acres that the family managed in and around the village, believing himself incapable of carrying out any kind of manual labour. By that summer he'd stopped sleeping, preferring instead to walk around the house until dawn. This in turn began to have a serious detrimental effect on his father. Seeking out what medical opinion he could, Thomas was taken to Nottingham to see a Dr. Brookhouse. His diagnosis was melancholia, for which he had no cure, prescribing a drug which would hopefully keep him calm, which is all the doctor felt able to do, and he sent the two men away with instructions to visit him again in 1 week. 5 days later, on the 20th of August, Thomas, having slept much of the night, awoke at around 5:30 a.m. According to his father, who had already been up for a good half an hour, he appeared quite rational. At about 6 a.m, James Gray left his son in the house, whilst he went into the cattle shed to milk the cow at the other end of the village. At the other end of the village, John Mellors was just getting up. After opening the shop's front shutters, he walked to the bottom of the stairs and called his sister Anne to come down and open up. It was the usual routine. Satisfied he could hear her moving around the bedroom, he left the house and walked up the yard. Hannah Fretwell, who lived across the road from the shop, saw her sister around 6:15 walk out to the side of the shop and pull open a small shutter forgotten by her brother. Some 15 minutes later, Hannah watched again as Thomas Gray, a man she had not seen for 4 years, walked past the window of her house, crossed the road and pushed open the wicket gate that led to the side door of her sister's house. Upstairs above the shop, Anne's mother Elizabeth heard the gate open and footsteps along the short path, and thought nothing of it and continued dressing. A little after 6:30 a.m, the mother walked downstairs and into the shop, expecting to find her daughter setting up for the day, but the shop was quiet. Joseph Holt heard his prospective mother-in-law first call out and then scream. Running downstairs, he found her knelt beside the body of her daughter, Anne, who lay on her back behind the shop counter. So savagely had she been attacked that blood pooled across much of the floor from the large open wound in her throat. She was clearly dead. Lifting her, he carried her into the back room and laid her on a sofa. There was nothing that anybody could do. Thomas Gray, meantime, walked calmly from the shop, down the street and into the yard of William Clark. At the time, William stood talking to Thomas's uncle, George Gray. It was clear to both men immediately. they saw that something desperate had just taken place. Thomas was covered in blood. It ran down his arms and soaked his trousers. Unable to comprehend what he was seeing, William grabbed him by the arm and dragged him into the house and locked the door. Lizzie was still in bed, so William pushed him into the bedroom. Thomas made no attempt to deny that he'd just murdered Ann Mellors, who was apparently quite calm and perfectly lucid. Leaving him in the bedroom with Lizzie, William went out to find James Gray. After telling him of his son's confession, the two men ran across the village to the Mellors house, where they found, as Thomas had said they would, that Ann Mellors had indeed been murdered. Returning to the Clark house, they tried to talk to Thomas and ascertain exactly what had taken place. But he was having none of it. Other than admitting the murder, there was precious little else that the man would say. It was after 9 o'clock that Police Constable Peck arrived at the house and took him into custody. At a special court hearing held in Bingham on the 27th of August, Henry Wotton, surgeon of the parish, gave the first real clue as to what had happened that morning. According to his testimony, Ann Mellors had in all probability been attacked from behind, and because the wound that killed her had been made to the left side of her neck, whoever wielded the razor which had been found at the scene had been right-handed. Further examination of Ann's body, after it had been removed from the house, revealed that she sustained 10 distinct cuts. It was the first cut, however, which the doctor believed had resulted in death. He told the court that this cut had penetrated so deep as to sever her spinal cord, and that mercifully death would have been instantaneous. All the others, though, would have been life-threatening, and they had, in his opinion, been the result of a frenzy. It was doubtfully added that Ann Mellors had ever really been aware of her assailant until he was behind her, and then it would have been too late to have done anything about it. After listening to other witness evidence, the special hearing charged Thomas with wilful murder, and he was placed in custody to await his trial. The trial would take place on the 31st of October, before Mr. Justice Hawkins, with Mr. Etherington Smith acting for the defence and Mr. Mellor QC for the prosecution. From the outset, it was the defence's intention to prove insanity. There was no doubting that Thomas Gray had committed the murder, and since his arrest he had never once denied it. The question the defence counsel intended to put to the jury was, did Thomas Gray know what he was doing at the time? Obviously, if they could place enough doubt into the minds of the jurors, then that was their best shot at winning. Dr. Brookhouse, whom Thomas had met with some 5 days before the murder, was of the opinion that melancholia was a form of insanity. Furthermore, he told the court that he was also of the opinion that it could lead to delusional tendencies, which in turn brought about homicidal mania. And if this was the case, he argued, then these feelings of homicidal mania would inevitably bring about a sudden attack of violence, which would be perpetrated on any person with no distinction being made between friend or foe. Dr. Phillimore, medical superintendent of the county lunatic asylum at Sneinton, added further evidence. Having met with Thomas whilst he'd been incarcerated in Nottingham prison, he too had formed the opinion that the man suffered from melancholia. He cited the fact that Thomas had left his murder weapon, a cut-throat razor, at the scene of the killing. Discarding the means of carrying out a murder at or in the vicinity of the body was classic, he argued, in that type of mental derangement. Mr. Etherington Smith had by this time begun to create doubt. Insanity, he continued to insist throughout the day, was a symptom suffered by Thomas Gray, and had definitely contributed to the murder he'd carried out. He used the two doctors' evidence to ram home the point that the condition was one which the defendant had suffered from years, but it had only been over the summer months that this condition had had a serious deterioration. It was a compelling argument, and no doubt one which received some sympathy from those sat in the courtroom. Unfortunately for Mr. Etherington Smith, it was not a view which was shared by those who'd spent the previous 8 weeks sharing a cell with Thomas Gray. Joe Hardy and Charles Gray, no relation, told the court that the defendant had told them not only of his guilt but also of the charade he'd made of feigning insanity. As far as they were concerned, he was guilty of murder. Dr. Isaac Macy, surgeon for the prison, tended to agree. In his opinion, no delusional sides had been exhibited whilst the patient was under his care. He had, he testified, discussed the murders at length with Thomas, and apart from claiming not to have been aware of his actions, he offered up no explanation. Ann Mellors had died as a result of her refusal 4 years earlier to marry him. Mr. Justice Harkins agreed, informing the jury during his own summing up that there seemed little evidence to convince the court that Thomas Gray had not understood his actions on the 20th of August. The guilty verdict, when it came some minutes later, was as expected. George Bulk, who had acted as a solicitor for Gray, immediately mounted a petition for his reprieve. He argued strongly that the killing was motiveless, that Gray had never pursued Ann Mellors once his marriage proposal had been rejected. Therefore it could not be argued that he'd killed her for this very reason, and that the prisoners who testified he had talked of insanity as though he'd invented the whole condition to evade conviction should never have been allowed to testify in court. And finally, that homicidal mania had been proved. It had merit and found some support amongst the lawyer classes, but not with the Secretary of State. It was rejected on the 19th of November, and the unfortunate Thomas Gray was executed at 8 o'clock on the morning of the 21st of November 1877. Well, how do I feel about this case? For a start, it's very strange that somebody would wait 4 years after being turned down to commit murder. You'd expect something to be done much more sudden, but maybe it was because he'd caught wind of the fact this lady was going to accept somebody else's proposal. Maybe that is what ultimately sealed her fate. Now, it's all very well saying that he suffered from some form of melancholy, but we all get sad, and I seriously do not think that any form of depression is a valid excuse for somebody to commit the crime of murder. Ultimately, this person died for the sake of jealousy, and it's a sad, sad thing. The truth is that 2 people lost their lives to this crime. One of them, the poor lady whose throat was slit, and the other one being the man who did it. And although I have some sympathy for him, he could have gone on to bounce back from her rejection. He could have chose to court somebody else, he could have chose to better himself, and instead he let himself stew in it and ultimately become a murderer. This is a lesson to not obsess on the things you can't have, and instead push forward and focus on a better tomorrow. Okay, this is Kerr9000 from the Gunkiss Murder Mystery Channel, signing off, telling everybody to keep pushing forward to a better tomorrow, and take care. Hope you join me next time. Goodbye.